Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about this sword and why I think it's cool. This is an example of a Hanwei practical katana from the way back when, the original version, not the kind that you would necessarily see today, though it's very similar to what you would see today. Incidentally, I've made a video on the Hanwei practical swords, a review, and it's linked in the description down below. The basic gist, if you're interested in buying one, is I think they're a bit overpriced with the exception of the Hanwei XL. I think those are a better value than the basic practical stuff, but this one is an original one, and what makes it special is kind of its place in history in the non-traditional Japanese-style swords that were available for practitioners. Now, this is probably 20, 30 years old at this point, I think over 20 years old, and at the time, there were just not a huge amount of options available. So more and more options became available, but Hanwei was one of the first to kind of do something that emulated historical Japanese-style swords well enough that a practitioner would like it. And it was one of the first examples that gained a lot of notoriety in Japanese-style swordsmanship circles. But also to do it at a effective cost. Now, the story as I know it, I'm not a historian, I haven't done a lot of research on this, I'm recanting the story as I've heard, so if you know more, throw it in the commentary down below. But Hanwei, and I don't know if they went by Hanwei at the time, made a series of daggers or tantos. I've had a couple of them in my collection, they're all right, and then produced the Shinto katana, but in seeing that in museum replicas, catalogs and stuff, it went for over $1,000, and it put it kind of on par with the least expensive guntos and things like that you might want to practice with. So it wasn't necessarily a cheap option. And then the practical came along, and I want to say it was around $300 or $400, which is not nothing. It's not nothing in today's money, and it was certainly more 20, 30 years ago. But it was one of the first examples of a, modern-made, practical, functional object that you could use that actually did the job for Japanese-style swordsmanship, and that's why I think it's cool. By today's standards, this really isn't much. The Ito is tight, and it does things, but it misses a lot of marks, and I think there are better options available if you were spending $300 or $400. But at the same time, there was not as many options, and basically from what I've had that's gone through my collection that have been available at similar price points at the same time, the sayas didn't fit quite as well, and the handles were not as close in emulation to Japanese style swords. This is really one of the first options that became available that was suitable. Now, if you were lucky enough really early on, 60, 70 years ago, people were telling me that when they went to antique shops, there were a lot of, things brought back from World War II, and they could go into those shops, go to where the canes were held, and buy a Japanese style sword for $20 or $30. And that was really never my experience as a person interested in swords. When I got into it, and there were options available, but a lot of them were sword-like objects or really, really cheap. And this was the first sword that I really could recognize by name and by brand. It was the first one when I started asking people what was good that came up as a recommendation. So I think it's really cool, and it was one of the first examples that gained notoriety and gained success. And I think because of that success, you see a lot of the market that you do today. There's certainly a lot more options. Things have improved. Hanwei, I don't think is necessarily has the same market share as perhaps they once did, but they haven't improved the same way other examples have. So this does a lot of things right, and I think some things right that Hanwei doesn't necessarily do as well today. One, the Ito is very tight. It's held up. This is 30 plus years old. It hasn't seen a lot of use, but it hasn't degraded substantially either. It doesn't look like it's been rewrapped, but the Ito is tight. And I want to say that the Hanwei Shintos, the older ones, tend to be a little bit tighter. Some of the newer stuff I don't necessarily think is as tight. Transitions aren't perfect, but overall nothing bites into my hands. Nothing's terrible, and it's got simple blackened or blued steel Fuchikasha with little copper accents. The Manuki are made of copper, the Shidodome are made of copper, the Shidodome on the Kurigata is made of copper, and so that at least is nice. They've transitioned and are usually made of brass now. I can't tell if the Samegao is real or not. It's supposed to be fake. I can't take the handle off. These were always supposed to be glued on. I did remove the peg and gave it a few taps with a hammer, and nothing came loose, so I left it alone, figuring that it's probably glued. But anyway, the handle, while you couldn't take it apart, it still feels good enough and feels like a traditional style Japanese handle. And transition-wise, things line up. Simple blued Suba as well. This was on the Musashi and some of the earlier products from Hanwei. They did away with it, and I think the upgrade that they put on the newer version of their Musashi as well as the practical are better, but you can usually recognize some of the older stuff by these simple kind of blued fittings. Also blued seppa, these pieces around the habaki, the washers that separate the guard, are also blued. I don't know if they're made of brass or if they are also just blued steel. The blade is still also very sharp. It had a bit of rust on it. I cleaned some of that off with a little bit of Mother's Mag. But overall, I like the shape. I like the way this feels. It's got a little bit of heft to it, but comfortable. And I think the really important thing, since I'm not reviewing this, I can't help myself sometimes, is just that this was one of the first things available for $300 or $400 that did all of those things. That kind of felt like a Japanese style sword, but on a budget. And yeah, there were concessions, but at the same time, it still was functional and close enough a recreation that it wasn't like an artistic interpretation of a Japanese sword. It was a reasonable replica of a Japanese style sword, such that it would allow you to practice with and do Japanese style swordsmanship and improve your technique and the like. So anyway, that's why I think it's cool. And I think that a lot of the swords that I've come to enjoy today probably wouldn't be around if it weren't for the success of this one. I really have no idea how many were sold, or even if Hanwei thinks of it as a success. I would hope so, because it was one of the first sword that I remember. When I went to a dojo and asked what kind of sword should I get, the Hanwei Practical was. There were a lot of them in use. It was one of the most accessible, prolific, easy to find information on swords that were out there. In retrospect, if I had bought this one, I don't know if my channel would exist, because I actually happen to like this one. I ended up buying a sword that I didn't like, and that made me frustrated and started reviewing swords. But I digress. That's a different story. This, anyway, has been the Hanwei Practical. It's an interesting sword, and if you're also enthusiastic about Japanese-style swords, it's just something that's worth knowing about, I suppose. Anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully the video is interesting. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.